we're back again here, working on the Helix T-Rex gas conversion, continuing to strip down the frames, got the entire main rotor stack out of it, took the bearing supports apart and cleaned them up. I'm actually using these, got these a long time ago, old KDE upgrade main bearing blocks. Since the old T-Rexes only had 2 main bearings instead of 3, they had these bearing blocks that have thrust bearings in them, which is really nice. Took those apart. They definitely needed to clean. I had to scrub out the thrust bearings and clean and re-grease everything, but it all feels smooth. Went together pretty nice. Also pulled the tail case and split that. One thing I want to show you here, it's hard to see in this light, but for these old torque tube T-Rexes, the end of the gear that the torque tube end fits in, it's really hard to see, but what happens is that cross or X shape kind of gets wallowed out. I have one of these replacement red ones. You can see the nice clean cross shape. The old ones, it gets worn out. So if you get a lot of play in your tail, if you can hold the main rotor and rotate your tail rotor 30-40 degrees, it's usually because there's play where the end of the torque tube fits in that. That's the end of the torque tube. It gets loose in there and starts to move around. So what I do is every once in a while I replace that, and also if it's still not tight enough, put a little bit of Scotch tape on the end of the torque tube. So I'm going to replace these, put this all back together, just like when you're working on your car. You always do the water pump when you do a timing belt. Well, I got it out. I'm going to replace all these bearings, assuming I have extras. Now I've got the engine off, pulled the tail. Tail is just sitting over there in the corner, and started to take the head apart. If you ever wondered what a 10-year-old main shaft looks like, that's it. I built this in 2014, and it's never had a hard crash. That's still the original main shaft. It's in pretty good condition, so that's going to stay. Replacing the head block with a smaller one, lower profile. And I'm going to try this heavy-duty main gear. I already have the KDE heavy-duty one-way bearing block in this thing, but add the KDE main gear and see if I can make it fit. That's what we're doing now, so the build continues. Hey guys, so we're back, still working on the Helix. The teardown continues. As you can see, I've got a lot of it apart now. Starting to go through all the mechanics. So as I go through this, in addition to making the upgrades I talked about, I'm also planning to just do a usual annual service. It's been a long time since I ran through this thing, so I'm taking everything apart. All the bearings, the grips, pulling shafts, pinion, tail, and so forth, and checking all the gears, checking all the bearings, checking everything like that. First thing I did was I took apart the main gear and one-way hub. I was going to try that heavy-duty main gear, but just like I remembered from 10 years ago, it does not fit. It's way too tight. The only thing I can guess is that the original 700 Nitro Pro or 700E probably had a really loose gear lash, and they machined it a little bit oversized to tighten things up and take some of that play out. This is set up really tight, and since it's a gas motor, the way these are installed, because the engine mounts at multiple points, you can't adjust anything. So once it's set up, the lash between the pinion and the main gear is fixed. So there's no adjustability, and that heavy-duty main gear is way too tight. I did clean up the existing main gear I have. It's just a standard old Align 115 tooth Mod 1 straight gear. Luckily, I have one backup because I don't even know if they make these anymore. But anyway, I took it apart, gave it a wash with just soapy water in the sink. Also took apart the one-way bearing mount because there was some crunchiness in the guide bearings. So I took that all apart. That's actually the KDE heavy-duty one-way bearing mount. So took that all apart. One of the bearings was crunchy. Luckily, in my pile of spares, I did have an extra bearing to replace it. Just, I don't know where I tossed it. Probably threw it in the trash already. Just a really little thin support bearing. Took that out, cleaned everything up, greased it up really good. Based on tips on Heli Freak, I'm using this stuff, the Kluber Isoflex special grease on that Sprag type one-way bearing. So I put all that back together. Next thing up is I'm going to take the head apart and install that new head block. So while I'm at it, I've also undone everything. So undid all the screws. And like I've said before, if you don't have one of these, a gyroscopic screwdriver like this DeWalt. This is the fancy one. I think it was 80 bucks. The cheaper one is like 60. Makes this go so fast. Just zip them all out with speed tips or just some inexpensive hex drivers. So I'm going to pull everything. Going to check all these bearings. I found one crunchy bearing. There's probably other crunchy bearings. Going to take the entire clutch stack apart, which is right in there. There's the clutch and the pinion and the generator. Take all that apart, clean it all out, grease up those bearings, replace anything that I need to. And then I'm going to start working on stuff like swapping out the servos and some of the other upgrades. While I'm at it, I'm also going to redo all the wiring. I mentioned I want to try a Spirit, so we got to redo things as it is, but I also want to reroute some things. This is one of the early helis I built, and my wiring job was not really great. Look at that, right? So there's wires everywhere. I've got some ideas on how to really clean it up this time. Simplify things, so it's a redo. So as I take things apart, what I've been doing is just labeling, so I know where everything goes later, so I remember what I did. And that's it. So we're moving along. About a half a day's work so far, and we're going to keep going. Thanks a lot, guys. See you later.